Let's get started. I think just trying to be synchronized to all the sessions. So let's get started. Thank you very much for coming to these sessions. So today what I'm going to talk about is a little bit on design tools. But what's more accurately to present this talk is about, as a developers, what what to expect for you from designer for Android development. So my name is Taylor Ling. I'm coming from Malaysia. It's quite far away. I'm co-founder of Fabulous App. Probably you have heard it from Mature Design Award. I'm also a product design Google expert. So very happy to be here to share some of my experience. So let's dive into it. So in a not so distant past, like 7 years ago, when you ask designer, what kind of software that they use to do mockups, to do screen design, most of the time you will get answers like Photoshop, Illustrator, Fireworks. That's pretty basic back then. But the problem with this tool is they are not designed to do mockup, digital product design. And like we try a lot of workaround just to make things work for us. And move forward to today, 7 years after. And there's so many tools out there. So many nice tools that help designers to make their work more efficiently and able to communicate better with developers. So this is why I think as a developer, it's something that you should care about. Probably not about whether you should use it, but more about knowing the availability of this tool for the designer. So what I strongly believe is that one of the core part in creating great experience or great product is, of course, a very close collaboration between designer and developers. And with the tools available out there, it helps designer to actually produce high quality design handoff for the developers. So you guys are able to, make the implementation much more efficient and much more perfect, pixel perfect. So also, probably there will be, definitely a debate online saying that, should designer code? It's one of the pretty famous debates online. But the same thing you can look back on the other side, where should engineers design? So it's like a chicken and egg problem. But what I think is the best way is to push both sides, where one way the designer try to be very close working together with developers to make sure the product is implemented as intended. But at the same time, for designer to also learn a little bit on coding, to understand the beauty of coding. So it makes the communication much easier. So with that, let's dive into, because there's so many things that I want to cover in these short sessions. So first thing first, when you talk about design, definitely visual design is the first thing come in mind. So for example, we definitely do screen mock, screen design. We also use tools that are available to us to make icons and then illustration as well. So the very popular tools right now, of course, is Sketch. I'm sure you heard about it. Probably you never know what is that, but Sketch is basically a digital product design tool that allows designer to create mockups, icons, illustration much more easier. And also it's a vector editor tool. So it makes designing scalable. So it's a very nice tool, and it just came out 7 years ago, and it changed the whole design industry for digital product designer. But also, definitely there are some alternatives nowadays, like Adobe Experience Design, Framer, Graphic Designer, Figma. These are all the tools that actually pretty capable as well compared to Sketch. But the most popular one, I think, at the moment is still Sketch. And in Fabulous, we use it a lot. So in this case, let's focus on the screen mock design, okay? Because that's the most basic mockup or basic design coming out from the designer. So screen design, of course, for Android design, the designer should already started designing with this base size, 360 times 640. That's the base size for Android app in phone, of course. If you are at Johannes and Johannes sessions about responsive design, it's something that you have to keep in mind when you're designing this. You definitely need to keep responsive in mind. But this is the base size to design so that it can adapt to many different sizes. But what's the advantage of using these base sizes? You know, one of the things is that because this size is at MDPI or 1x, and what's the most advantage of using this size is because it helps in spec handoff. Okay, what does it mean by it helps? So for example, if you see that the icons you have in the sketch saying that it's a 24 times 24 points, and that's directly translated to 24 dp in Android development environment. For example, if you see the gap between the card and the today label, it's a 24 dp. It's actually in sketch, it shows 24 points. So that's the very advantageous thing that when you're designing in this size. And also, definitely on assets management, because when you're at this size, you can easily extract the assets for the developer to use at different DPI, which I will cover later a little bit on assets management. So you must be asking why. Why it should be 360 times 640, this base resolution, but not like the bigger screen sizes like those in Google Pixel. So let's just do a comparison, a simple comparison, where you can see that the screen estate in Google Pixel sizes, it has this extra space, at the sides, and it's a very dangerous thing for designer to have, because most of the time when you have this luxurious space in the screen estate, designer will tend to put in a little bit more things in it, without thinking of the consequences of when it's developing and implementing in a small screen. Some of the things doesn't fit, so it's still best to design in a base resolution of 360, 640. So that's our experience in Fabulous. But of course, is that all? There's also Android devices with smaller screen sizes, and with the recent release of Android Go, there's actually even smaller size. So you can see the comparison here. So this is something that also you guys and also designers should be aware of. But most of the time, of course, if you have the right responsive design in mind, it's totally going to be scalable pretty nicely. But some of the screens that we discovered in Fabulous, like in this one, the pricing plan screens, we discovered that some of the things is not as responsive as what we thought. So we actually redesigned a little bit just to make sure that it's also fit into a smaller screen size. And I think it's very important to also really focus on smaller screen sizes to make it work, because Android Go, I think, is pretty much very nice push from Google that most of the people were going to get Android Go devices. So optimizing it around Android Go devices is pretty makes sense. And also with these design tools, there are a lot of templates. For example, if you are using material design, there's a material design template in it. So what you can expect from the design mockup is a more consistent design in terms of UI elements. Like I still remember back then when we used Photoshop to design it, we have to design it in a rather large screen artboard size, and then we tend to recreate stuff from scratch. So sometimes you can see very inconsistent things, like the button have a 2-point corner radius there, and then there's a 3-point corner radius here. With templates, all this stuff should not be worried anymore. So as a developers, what you can expect from designer nowadays with these design tools is, for visual design, what you can expect, definitely screen design in proper sizes. If you need a guide or design guide in a smaller sizes, go back to your designer, get them to have their input, how the UI should be response to a smaller screen size. And also, as I said, with design template, symbols, styles, a more consistent design can be expected from designer. So that's visual design. But of course, just the screen mock is not enough. To implement it, definitely you need design assets from designer as well. So definitely one thing about designer is that they have to identify what are the things that they have to extract or generate for developers to use. So in this case, you can see from just one interface, the designer need to identify what are the things that need to extract. For example, icons, illustrations, and they do also need to understand what are the things that they do not need to extract. For example, the fab, okay? For example, the card. Those are the things that can be done in code. So they need to understand that so to be more efficiently extracting all the design assets for you to use. But of course, knowing what part to extract is just one part of it. Giving you, as a designer, giving to the design assets to developers in a correct format is also very important. So in this case, some of the things can be in PNGs, of course, the best format for Android. But in some cases, SVG, like the vector format, is good, like small icons. And also, if let's say if it's an image without transparency information, JPEG can be a good candidate. And I will show you why. So then, of course, using PNGs, definitely the designer need to know that they have to extract their design assets in all DPI. If they are not doing that, go back to them. They are responsible for that. But of course, as I said, if you talk about SVG vector format, you can use this as a vector drawable in Android. So they just need to extract the icon, for example, in just 1x, and then you can use it for different screen sizes. Anyway, if you are interested in the vectors workflow, Nick have a really nice presentation last year. So this is the link to the presentation. So then that's about the formats. But often when you look at the design or the screen design, you probably will not know what happened or how actually a certain UI element are constructed. So in this case, let's look at the ritual card in Fabulous. So it's just a simple card like this. But what are the layering happen in between? So let's just have a look on a different perspective. And you can see that actually just a simple card like that. There's a certain level, certain layers of different elements like text, of course, the screen, just to do text protection because you need, if the background is too bright, you can't see the text. Then, of course, there will be an asset which is like right aligned to the card, and then there will be a card using the background color that is matching with the assets. So all these information should be delivered to you by the designer. If it's not, go back to them. So this is what you can expect. So combine them together, and then you will see a complete UI element in the home screen. Then let's talk about the image assets. Because in Fabulous, when we first started, of course, we definitely go all in for PNGs because it provides the best quality in terms of visual, in terms of quality. But over time, we have a lot of illustration in the app. And then what we found out is that when we use PNGs, it's a problem there because what we found is that with the folder full of assets, it's like 46 megabytes of files in the APK itself, which is really huge. It's not ideal for a download size. So this is why we then, last year, we relook everything again to see what kind of things that we can optimize. So this is what we did for the optimizations. So first of all, we look at the images that doesn't need transparency information. We convert all of them to JPEG. Okay, but mind you, if you convert directly from PNG to JPEG, your JPEG actually can have a bigger size compared to the PNG. That's very strange, actually. The algorithm is very different. But then we move forward. We do a lot of experiment, a lot of testing, just to find the balance between visual quality and then the file size. So what we landed is we decided to go for 90% PNG quality and then also 85% for JPEG, which is something that is pretty acceptable, but producing a very nice file size to be used in the app. And we use the image Optim. This is a really nice Mac app to do a very quick batch quality optimization. And through the optimization, what we're able to save is more than 56.5%. And that's really, really huge saving in terms of APK size, because when you think about it, when the user doesn't need to spend like the extra 20 meg to download the app, the user will be more than happy to download the app. So that's a very nice optimization that we did, and I think this is something that the designer should take charge to ensure that the images, the assets doesn't bloat the app so much. Then, of course, one thing that we also discovered from design side is that when you use the same image in the Android development environment, if you use RGB 565 configuration, you tend to see, I'm not sure if you can see from the presentation slide, but you tend to see banding in the gradient. That's something that we discovered, and we didn't know why it's happened, and eventually we discovered that, oh, it was using RGB 565. So if your designer complained about it and you have no idea, probably that's the reason. So use ARGB 8888, it's probably the best configurations. Of course, definitely, if you why the different bitmap configuration is there, because some of the low-end devices might have lesser memory. So probably you will look at optimizing for low memory devices to use a different bitmap configuration. But for the most part, I think using the ARGB is a better choice because it provides the best visual quality. So that's design assets. So for developers, what you can expect from designer. This is all the things that designer should do. Provide you a usable design asset at the proper sizes for different DPI, of course, for Android. They are in appropriate format, JPEG, PNGs, or SVG. And if, let's say, there's a layering of how the asset should be used, they should be properly documented or at least communicated to the developers. So the developers will be able to know how to implement that. And of course, optimize the assets. So in the long run, you won't actually, like Fabulous, we actually have to relook everything at all. Everything one shot to have a look just to optimize it. It takes some time. So if you, let's say, optimize from the start, it's actually save a lot of time. Then we talk about visual design, okay, screen mock. We talk about design assets, where the designer should extract and allows the developer to implement it. But there's something else that developers definitely need, which is the design spec. So back then, I'm not sure if you've seen this before, when the designer want to do a handoff to the developers, they create this thing called red lines. So you have, tons of values there, lines, just to communicate what's the spacing between this and that. And just one screen probably is good. But let's say you have to do for 100 of screens, it's going to be painful. So this is why there's this new tool coming out. I'm pretty sure you heard about it, and some of you, I think, is already using it. It's called Zeppelin. Definitely, this is one of the best design tools that are coming out in these recent years. What Zeppelin does is that when the designer design in Sketch, for example, or Adobe XD, Photoshop, or Figma, so what the designer is able to do is to export all this design into Zeppelin. And what Zeppelin does is that it will generate the equivalent specs or rate line in the app itself or through the services. And when you look at, when you use the Zeppelin app, okay, it's fairly easy to see what are the specs, like, what are the gap between the cards and the label, what are the sizes of the text, what are the font type used in the text, what are the color, everything that you need for implementation is there. And they even generate some of the XML that you can just copy and use it, which is pretty cool. But for the most part, whatever information that you need is there. And you can also, have a very pinpoint level of commenting on certain part of the design. So, as a developers, you can just pinpoint that and telling that, oh, hey, Taylor, this is not possible, or this is a little bit confused. Can you explain a little bit more how it's constructed? So it's like a really nice communication tool between designer and developers. So in Zeppelin, of course, there's these less known features called pop screen out. If you have a chance to play around with Zeppelin, definitely use that, because that can pop out a screen where you have a certain level of transparency where you can just compare to your implementation or the emulator, just to check whether your implementation is on the right level of accuracy in terms of pixel level. Definitely not to ask for pixel perfect, but at least things are not too far off, and that's good enough. But of course, as a developer, you definitely know about show layout bounds, which is something in the developer tools where you can see how things are aligned, whether it's doing it properly. And you can also use the app by Faiz, keyline pushing app, which is a very nice way for designer and also developers to have a look how things are aligned and whether it's done correctly. But of course, some designer might not want to use Zeppelin for some reason. If let's say they are using Sketch, there's a plugin called Sketch Measures. It's free, and they are able to generate HTML with the mockups and all the stuff, where the designer can just send you the whole HTML with the similar rate line. So that's a pretty cool stuff as well, similar to Zeppelin. And if you use Malware and Evision, they also able to provide you this kind of specs, which is pretty cool if the designer is using this tool. So design specs, definitely Zeppelin #1. In Fabulous, we use Zeppelin a lot because it really helps in terms of communication. So what you can expect from designer, a complete design specs, okay, definitely with all the DP value, SP values for you to use in development. And of course, they should provide you some way for easier communication if there's something that you wanted more clarifications on certain part of design. So we covered the visual design, we covered design assets, we covered design specs. So what's more? When we design apps or a digital product, one thing that we always, not to say always, but sometimes we kind of ignore or forget is there's interaction in it. So when we design all these apps, the user is going to interact with it. So interaction design is a very important part of it. And with the tools now available nowadays, it's so easy for the developer, for the designer to come up with the interactive mockup that feels so real. But before we move to that, what are the basic things that you can expect from designer? Okay, so what I think is, of course, this, when you look at these screens, these are the static images designed by designer. So how do you want to know the relationship between these screens? That's the most important part, right? So of course, what you can expect from designer is a simple screen flow diagram. That's the most basic expectation from designer. If they are not doing that, they should do it, because developers should not be the one who actually try to figure out what are the relationship between screens. Because sometimes we use artboard to show some states, change of state. We use artboard to show something else. So this is why a very simple screen flow diagram should be done by designer, and it's very easy. It's very easy. You can just use Sketch, putting the artboard or just making a new artboard with the screens, and then you just link up with arrows and stuff. It's very simple. But there's also a few tools that you can use to do a little bit more interactive prototype. Okay, so Sketch recently just updated where you can do a very simple prototyping, where you can just select a hot region, and then you click on it, and then you can go to the next screen. So that's a very nice addition, and we will expect it to grow in the future. But you can use Sketch, Experience Design, Envision, Malware, Atomic, Principle. There's so many tools that's available out there. But one of the tools that we use a lot in Fabulous is Principle. So Principle, of course, for Mac only, but it's a very powerful tool. But it's a tool that really allows the designer, the learning curve is not that steep, but able to produce a very, very nice, very, very high quality interactive mockup. So for the developer to use to have a look how things work and stuff. So this is the interface of Principle. I wish I can show you if I have more time. So basically what you have is, of course, you have screens, telling them the connections. But the best part in Principle is that you are able to animate every single part of the element. So every layer, so in different timing. So at the bottom, you can see that there's timeline-based configurations for each element to animate in, the duration and blah, blah, blah. So it's really good for the designer to have the chance to actually play around to determine, what are the timing for this text to come out, what are the things should show when the user tap on this, and it's really, really great. So how does it work in terms of workflow? So designer will create static mockup in Sketch, for example. Then you can import it into Principle, and then you can create interactive mockup where you can say click on this one and then go to these screens. But at the same time, you can also do animation, movement of UI in Principle itself. And what the designer is able to do with Principle is they are able to export the whole interactions in video format or GIF or their own format, PRD file, where you can, if you have an iPhone, you can actually use the Principle app in iPhone and just have the PRD file, and you can actually interact with it, and you have all the animations there. It feels just like a real app, and it's very impressive. And also it can be exported as an app file, where it's like an executable file in Mac, so you can just double click, and then you will show a screen where you can interact, which is pretty cool. So let me show you one example. What are the things that can be done in Principle? So this is one of the real stuff that I created for the team to understand how these few screens should interact and what are the animation involved when the users click on certain button. So click on the button, and then there's a ripple effect. It's all done in Principle. And then you have the loading bar, and then once it's loaded, the animations of every text or buttons coming out, that's all done in Principle. And it's pretty cool if you run it on a phone. Of course, iPhone, sorry about that, but definitely when you use it, it feels just like a real app. And that's really important because you can't just tell the developers like how these things go on without showing them how it should behave. But is giving them this video enough? Giving them this video, it looks cool because they are able to see, oh, yeah, okay, these things move like this, makes sense, but I need to implement it. So how do I implement it? So one of the things that I think designers nowadays should do, which something that in Fabulous we do, is to provide specs as well for animation. That's very important because what we found out is that this is not some of the things that developers should figure out, because it's something that the designer already have. When they create these interactive mock-up animations, it's already there. They have already the information there. It's just about exposing all this information to the developers. So what the designer should do is, exposing this information in text in the narrative way, like changing opacity from 0 to 100% at this timing, using what kind of easing functions. And all this information helps a lot for developers. And we actually work hand in hand with the developers to just ensure that the information that we provide to them very useful for them. And they verified that it's really good. It's really straightforward, which I will show you a little bit on the example. So then that's on one part, like just the arrow animation. But what if it's a complex animation, like the last screen where you have text coming out at different timing, have different easing functions. So what we do is, besides providing a narrative way, we also provide, this is a narrative way, of course, where you can already see the sequence of what are the things that are coming in, right after that, what happened. But we also provide this very simple timeline graph, where you can have a very clear glance on, oh, okay, number 1 is coming in together with number 5. And then what else happened in the next delay and blah, blah, blah. So it's very useful for them to just have a very simple look and before they implement it. And they say this is really helpful for them, and I'm really glad to know that. So as a designer, definitely these are the things that they should provide you as for developers, because these are not something that developers should figure out, because it's going to waste so much time to just trying to match with the pacing and all the stuff. So some of the example that I get from the developers is, when I tell them that, hey, let's delay for 100 milliseconds. In Android, just set start delay 100, or scale from 0.8 to 1.0. It's just about using the initiate state and then animate it to the different states. So it's fairly easy for the developer to use if you understand about what is it all about. And the text, the narrative way is very closely how you describe it in code. And of course, animation in UI, especially, it won't complete without async functions. Like things in this real world doesn't move in the very linear motion. So this is why there's these things called is out, is in out, or is both. So these are the things that designer will use because we are used to that, is in, is out. But what if when the designer says, hey, use is out for this one? Actually, in Android, there's already an equivalent interpolator there. So like, for example, is out is linear out, slow in. So that's already very simple. When the designer says is out, these are the interpolator you should use. Or the designer sometimes can play around with the cubic bezier to just get a very nice or very different async function, so it behaves a little bit different compared to the default one. And you can just use path interpolator. They just need to provide you the 4 points, how the curve should be generated, and it's there. It's that simple. But let's just say the designer doesn't provide you any async functions. So how do you want to apply it? You definitely do not want to apply linear. So this is the cheat sheet that we use in Fabulous. So whenever there's an object that moves across the screen, okay, when it's inside the screens from point A to point B, use fast out, slow in, okay? If there's an object that actually coming from outside of the screen, entering to the screens, use linear out, slow in, and fast out, linear in is when there's an object already in the screen wanted to get out from the screens. So that's a basic thing that the async function that you can use, where it's also highlighted in material design motion. So it's a very nice way of creating a very natural feeling animation in the UI. So that's principle, of course, but if, let's say, the designer doesn't want to use the principle, there's also alternative like Framer. Framer is pretty cool, actually. Framer is actually the best in a way, but the learning curve is pretty steep because it involves some coding, but it's pretty cool. It's very powerful. Kite Compositor, one of the new software coming out, is also pretty cool. And Emission Studio is also coming out with their own, interactive mockup creators. It works pretty well. I actually have a chance to test their closed beta. It's pretty good, but so far I still think Principle is the best. So for interaction design, what you can expect from designer is at least a screen flow diagram for the connection of the screens, because this is not something that you should figure out. If there's an interactive or there's animation, they should provide you a high quality interactive mock or video to show all these things, how things should work. And also definitely provides you spec, ready to use spec on the animation, on the transitions, or sometimes I would just tell the developers things that, hey, this one when this screen going to screen B, we will just use a ripple effect, and that's it. This is something that built in Android already, so it's something the designers should be aware of. So we cover visual design, design assets, design specs, and interaction design. What else? And there's one thing that really nice that's happened recently, only like just 1 year back, is the designer finally have a way to do nice animation design in app. And if you still remember the mock-up that I showed you just now, so there's these loading animations that's happening and repeating. So imagine that you wanted to do this in code. It's going to be crazy. There will be so many back and forth with the developers telling them, oh, this should curve like this, and the scaling should be like this, and blah, blah, blah. It's crazy. But to do this in Fabulous, we use things called Lottie. Definitely, I'm pretty sure every one of you have heard of it. It's a very cool tool that the designer appreciate a lot, because it's a library for Android and also iOS that can parse the After Effects animations into a usable JSON file, where if it's a simple animation, you can just dump it in, put in the Lottie library, and it just works. That's how my developers telling me, like, it just works. Like, we're just putting it there and it just works without any problem. And that's really cool, because I still remember back then when we really wanted to do some really cool animations. It's so hard that there's so many things to think about and then communicate with the developers how things should work here and there. So with Lottie, it's pretty cool. It's very, very nice. So how the flow works, okay, from the designer point of view. So we design the illustrations. For my part, I created in Sketch because I'm more used to Sketch. But if the designer already used to using Illustrator, that's the best way, because you can just use the illustrations, directly import into After Effects. And then definitely the designer need to learn a little bit on After Effects. It's slightly complex, but if you once you get used to it, it can create a lot of very nice animation. So import the illustrations in After Effects, animates it, and then definitely you have to install a plugin called Body Moving. It's a plugin where the magics happen. So without body moving, actually Lottie will not happen. So using a body moving plugin, export it to JSON, and then the JSON pretty much is what the Lottie is. And the best part is, let's say if it's a simple animation, the designer can also export it as an AVD file, which is the animated vector drawables, which have a very nice performance in Android. Of course, if you want a cross-platform animation, the JSON file, the Lottie JSON file is still the best. So some of the tips that probably something that you should not, you don't have to know, but if let's say somehow your designer work on the Lottie files for you, probably something that you can be aware, what are the things that the designer should be aware of. So one of the things is that if let's say in the Android development environment, for example, in this case, the loading animation is at 230 dp. And in After Effects, what you have to do is the same amount of pixel, but in pixel. You don't actually need to care about the DPI, because let's say all the elements in your animation is in vector, it's going to scale up very nicely. So just design it in the same value of pixel compared to the DP. It will work just fine. And of course, as I said, make sure they are vectors so they are scalable. But not all After Effects features are supported. So this is one thing that the designer should be aware of. So when they create a Lottie file, they definitely have to test it on the mobile phone, Android devices, just to see whether the animation works as is intended. If it's not, then probably there's some unsupported features is being used. Then of course, if you want to create, like the simple animations like icon, which is something that very nicely added in material design, definitely there's a tool called Shapeshifter made by an ex-Googler. Very easy to use. Like we've been using it to test it, and then just recently we come out with a new animation for Fab, and it just works. It's really nice. So this is the interface where you can create an icon animation where it's a very nice transition between one icon to another icon. And this is all done with this web app. It's pretty cool. So for animation design, so what you can expect as a developer is, of course, when there's an animation involved, they have to show you a demo how these animations should use, like whether it's a loading, whether it's something else. And of course, they have to provide you a JSON file that is usable, okay, or an AVD file. Design it in proper size, because if you design it a bigger size, it's not a problem because it's still scaling. But what's the point? Because when you design it in a bigger screen, your file size is actually bigger. So create it in the 1x size, and then you can scale it any way you want, and you still retain the same file size. And of course, one of the advantages of Lottie is that the animation doesn't just have to be looping. It's one part of it, but you can also link the animation to progress. For example, you can link this animation to loading where if it's loading failed, it shows another animation, or it just stop there, and if it's successful, it will proceed to the next frame. So all these things is possible with Lottie. So if let's say a designer have this idea of creating this kind of experience, they have to tell you, okay, this is not something that you should figure out. They have to tell you what part, which frame, and how to link, what are the ideas that they have in mind. So that's about animation design. So we covered 5 different parts, and I think these 5 different parts are the most important things that the developers should expect from a designer, because nowadays the tools is there, it's possible for the designer to do it. Compared back then 7 years, it's impossible, or it's really tricky. But let's talk a little bit on how to work with designer, because I'm coming out from a designer point of view, and I work with a lot of developers, and developers are cool. Like, I really love to work with developers. But as a developer, you do have to realize that the designer for a digital product coming from different backgrounds. Some of them coming from screen illustrations, some of them coming from advertising. So they have a very different experience. And one of the things that I think is very, very important is, as a developers, you should understand that and how to break that, the gap, and then communicate very efficiently. So just some of a few points that I think, as a developers, some of the things that you can do. Okay, I'm not saying that you must, but these are things that I think it will be beneficial for the designer if, let's say, developers will be able to do these things. So, hey developers, let's get the designer to provide you with everything. Okay, do not try to figure out some of the things yourself, unless it's necessary, unless it's, the deadline is there and the designer is not responsive. Then probably, I'm sorry, you have to do it. But for the whole development process, I think whatever that's related to design, it's always best to go back to designer, because they are the stakeholders on the design part, and they are responsible to provide you with all the information. Second part is definitely communicate with the designer as much as you can, just to ensure that they are speaking the same language. And this is very important, because when I met some of the designers, I realized that they do not know what is fab. They do not know what is a navigation drawer. They don't even know, how to extract the design assets. They do not know what is DPI. So that's a very bad thing, because it's just going to impact the whole development flow. So this is why, if you are able to talk to the designer, I mean, not to say in a way to test them, but in a way just to ensure that it's synchronized. So both of you guys speaking the same language, and make everything so much easier. And as a developer, I understand, or designer as well, or everyone else, you will have a lot of assumption. But I think this is the most dangerous thing that can happen in the development workflow. So one thing about design is, as a developers, if you have any question at all, go back to the designer. It's not your responsibility to figure it out. It's, you're probably thinking well, the designer will not give me the answer. But, let's try, because it has to happen. They have to provide you the answer. So communicate with them, avoid assumptions, very important. One thing is that also, these are the things that I really appreciate for Fabulous team, or for all the developers that I worked before, is that these developers able to provide me the input, like what is possible, what is not feasible. Because sometimes as a designer, we come up with some crazy ideas, or fancy things that we think it's nice, but we didn't realize that in terms of development or in terms of implementation, it's really tricky, or it's almost impossible with this available timeline. So this is why what I think I would appreciate if the developer will be able to provide the designer, saying that, hey, I see your point here, you want to do this, but it's pretty tricky at this moment. We have this alternative that probably can provide you a similar experience, but it's much more easier to implement with the timeline that we have. And it will be very appreciated by the designer, because now they understand, oh, okay, so that's what is available and what's not. And definitely suggest alternative if something is not feasible, because as a designer, they do not know anything about coding and at the surface level. Also, as a designer, or as a developer, you do have to understand that designer doesn't speak logic or doesn't speak code. So it's hard. I understand that they should understand that in terms of logic, how things work. But you will feel surprised that actually not all of them actually able to talk about things in logic way, because they just think from a designer point of view. So understand that, but also help them to understand what are the constraints that's in the development environment, what are the things that is not possible and what's possible. So definitely understand that. Not all designers will be able to speak logic. And also try to avoid using jargon. If you have anything, when the designer asks you some questions like, hey, can you explain me how these things work, or what kind of possibilities there? Just try to explain it in a very simple English, so that very simple way, so that they are able to understand it and they will be able to respond to you. Otherwise, when they are not understanding it, they will just, okay, yeah. So that's how you should actually, explain it. Like the 5 years kids, like they really won't be able to think from a logic point of view, unlike you guys. So that's that. And I think also it's very important as a developer to understand the business goal. I really dislike when someone is just designing something or developing something without knowing what's the goal, what is the business goal. So I think as a developer, definitely need to understand that, the business goal, what are the things that, why you should do that, and it's aligned with the designer. And definitely, one thing that I really hope also is, as a developer, definitely you have so many things already in the development environment. But also sometimes, like when you have some free time or just come across a design article, just read it. Just to understand, just to observe the beauty of design, okay? Because it's something that probably it can be useful in your implementation as well, because I strongly believe coding is also design, okay? You have nice structures, you have the way how things work, it's also design. It's just a different way, visual or coding. So just to recap, so what we discussed just now is, we covered the design tools that the designer have nowadays, and what are the things that you can expect from the designer. So visual design, design assets, interaction design, and animation design. So what are the things that you should expect them to hand off to you? So what's next for the design tools? Okay, what's next? So I come across these tweets from this guy, and I really hope that one day maybe some of this will happen, but it's still going to be a long way to go, and I don't believe it will come anytime soon. So what I strongly believe is that closing the gap first between the designer and developers, just understanding how things work from each perspective, and I think that way you will be able to create a very great product with the new design, with the availability of the design tools. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you learned something from this talk. Thank you.